I'm Steephen Grootes. I'm the senior political reporter at Eyewitness News. Some say I'm a political analyst. I'm also the author of the book SA Politics Unspun. Yeah, I think it's a completely false assumption. The reason is that around the world we see very small percentages of young people voting. I mean, if you look at the United States, across Europe, we see really less than 10% of people under 30 voting at all. That changes sometimes. We saw with Barack Obama's first campaign that more young people were energized to vote, if you like. But generally speaking, I don't expect that we'll have a very high number of young people voting next year. I think it's foolish to think our young people are different to anyone else's. From a percentage point of view, it's not that important. You know, obviously it depends on how many of them vote, and it depends how they vote. If we see very high numbers of young people voting and they vote in a way different to older people, then sure, it matters. But I don't think that that's really going to happen. It's important in another way, though, because it feeds into a much bigger political narrative about whether or not the ANC is still certain of victory in the way that it has been. It's about what we call the liberation dividend. In other words, is the ANC certain it will win an election just because it brought freedom to South Africa in 1994 on its version of historical events? And as a result, and the people who are generally more interested in politics and almost always vote are the elderly. And this we see around the world, and there are reasons for this. Politics is something you're interested in as you get older, as it affects you, as you build up a stake in society, you play more of a role in those discussions. There are counter-arguments to this. Some people would say that it's really very, very bad and disappointing that the youth, for example, on a public holiday, don't go and get involved in political events. Other people might say it's very good news that that doesn't happen. We didn't fight as young people to get involved in politics so that we would have to stay involved in politics when their children come of age. In other words, in a way, people fought for their children to be able to do what they wanted to do, not what they felt they had to do. It depends if these young people don't vote as they get older as well. There has to be a link, I think, between young people picking up stones and throwing them at police cars, as we've seen in Bekkersdal, as we've seen in Katsong, and the fact that younger people aren't voting. In other words, people give up on parliamentary politics. They give up on formal politics, changing the situation by voting, and then start to try and change the situation by picking up stones. There's a link between the two. It's not always a direct link, there isn't always a causal link between the two, but certainly we must discuss how one affects the other. And I think if we start to see that fewer and fewer people vote, the chances of more service delivery protests rise. And the numbers that you really need to look at here, if you look in the Northwest, in the 2011 elections and the local government elections in the top three provinces in the country, so Limpopo and Mpumalanga and the Northwest, those three northern provinces, you had polls, the percentages of people voting, of just 49.5%, 50.5% and 51.5%. Those populations are 95% black. They couldn't vote under apartheid. They're choosing not to vote. Why? There are lots of different things. I mean, the ANC will go to Twitter, so will the DA. They've all got a huge Twitter presence. It's not that simple. It's about having candidates who appeal to the youth. So someone like Mmusi Maimane, I think, is an attempt by the DA to have someone who is young. He's a success story. He's an aspirational figure. There's all sorts of dynamics going on there. But the only way really to do it is do what Barack Obama did. Change the story. It's very hard. You've got to really know what you're doing. You also have to have a huge amount of resources. Yes, you can't fight and you can't say that we have a right to vote without also saying that we have a right not to vote. Now, you also are able to calibrate things at the moment. So, if you are ticked off with the current system, you don't like what we have at the moment, and you want to make a statement, you actually have two ways you can do it. You can not vote, so you don't go to the polling station at all, and you can go and spoil your ballot. And that's a calibration. In other words, if I don't vote, I feel sort of strongly about it. Maybe I'm just apathetic. But if I go and spoil my ballot, I'm saying that I reject all of these parties. And that's a really important thing to be able to do. And I think that calibration is really important. You can't say that the right to vote is important and then take away the right not to vote. It can't work like that. And I'm sure, I mean, maybe people might want to try what that's like in other countries, but in all of those countries, it's a really minimal fine. You know, and it can't be a big fine, because you can imagine what would happen here. So what would you do to people who can't pay the fine? Would you put them in jail? Really? For not voting? Come on.